what they call woke science spending means researchers here must find a way, if possible, to navigate those changes. And here to talk about all of this is Brian Gordon. He is the business and technology reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. He covers this extensively. He joins us along with Dr. Charles Lee, associate professor and former director of the Center for Biomedical Engineering and Science at UNC Charlotte, now chief operating officer of medical research at VitriStor. He's speaking with us today as a professor and as the owner of a biotech startup, not on behalf of the university. And he is here with J.P. Flores, who is a Ph.D. candidate in bioinformatics and computational biology at UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you all for being here. Good morning. Welcome.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
Brian, you're our returning champion, so I'm starting with you. These cuts to research, as I said, started early last year. Some were stopped by the courts, others restored, while some remain in limbo. With reference to North Carolina, how many programs, do we know how many programs or how much money in total we're talking about in terms of losses?
Um, I think the dust is still waiting to be settled on kind of concrete numbers in terms of programs. The way I thought about it, and it really started to take shape very early upon the return of President Trump to DC, was us being the triangle. There being really three buckets or three pillars that were impacted by federal policy changes. One, of course, is the universities, which is really the bedrock of the Raleigh-Durham area, Duke, UNC in particular, with NIH, National Institutes of Health funding. But then we're also home to federal campuses. NIH has its only campus outside of DC, and it's in North Carolina in our Research Triangle Park. And then the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has a very large campus here too. And then thirdly, and this was probably the most abrupt funding change, was to foreign research nonprofits. We have two in particular called RTI International, is quite prominent in the nonprofit research space. And then a foreign research, they really do a lot of work around HIV AIDS around the world. It's called FHI 360. And they really seemingly overnight with the gutting of USAID lost a third to half of their funding and had to do furloughs and layoffs pretty immediately.
So I know that you said, Brian, that the dust is still settling on this, so we're not exactly sure on the money figures that we're talking about in terms of losses. But can you thumbnail it? Is that loss in the millions? Is it in the billions? And the jobs lost as a result, is it hundreds of jobs? Is it thousands of jobs? What is it?
Yeah, I think the jobs one is really hard to kind of gauge just because they're, even within the three pillars, there are just so many things. So RTI International, one of the biggest employers, they have cut their staff by at least a third. But I think it's kind of hard to tally it all. But in terms of gauging the funding, the B word is used. It's billions.
Okay.
And there are, as you mentioned, tons of court cases that have kind of been working through this. And what happened, it's been reported at a national scale, but we've seen it locally too, is about halfway through the year, NIH funding, which was really lagging the previous year, actually started to pick up a lot because the government began a policy of giving more money up front to fewer grants. So a higher concentration of money per grants that we're getting it. Under our new system, that does have researchers worried long term about what the funding could mean overall. And so, yeah,
Is there a pattern to where that money is going that might be different from where it went in the past that you can detect?
I think the clearest is where the money isn't going. And you mentioned up top, like there is, it's been expressed that artificial intelligence, certain energy projects, quantum computing, which is unrealized, but further down the road than AI. But if it's achieved, it would be quite transformative. They're still investing in that. Um, where it's not is a lot of as widely reported, anything that mentioned diversity and a lot of early career science programs to help encourage young scientists advance in the field, get in the field. A lot of those programs have been ended.
You're at the Raleigh News and Observer, and they're right there at the Research Triangle. And the Research Triangle has become an economic engine for this state. And you wrote a really interesting article, Brian, that included a bit of history about how that area came into being, in which you talked about, or you wrote about, a man named, I hope to say his name correctly, Vannevar Bush, who
Yeah.
headed the Office of Scientific Research and Development in 1945. It was a wartime agency. With the war winding down, they wanted to find a way to, I guess, use what they had built up for peacetime research. And he wrote a report, the title of which puts the importance of all this into focus, called Science, the Endless Frontier. Sounds Star Trekian. Scientific and investigations and discoveries are never ending, and that means a never ending need for funding, but it also promises, it seems to me, a never ending supply of breakthroughs and new products, which leads to money being made. Has anyone calculated, Brian, the cost benefit ratio of all this research that we pour money into?
Um, like I'm struggling with kind of hard figures, but it was born out of, yeah, World War II. And if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, Leander Bush has a character in it. It was this idea that like the government realized, oh wow, when we concentrate intelligence and money towards missions, we can achieve something um, grand. And they kind of took that mindset, especially with this paper that Bush wrote, to realize that it could continue to have a role. So after that, after the war, NIH funding really blossomed and developed into the world's biggest kind of research funding arm. And it had and remains today. And so yeah, especially for the triangle, it's really what made the triangle the triangle. Research Triangle Park formed because we have the three universities, Duke, UNC Chapel Hill, NC State. They started giving out their first NIH grants shortly after World War II. Locally from that, SAS is a company that came from an NC State NIH grant, and that's been one of the most influential companies in Cary. And there's HIV research from Duke. A doctor named Dr. Barton Hayes has been pretty instrumental in that. And so, yeah, it's myriad the impacts. And whether you agree or not, that has been up until this point the dynamic that the rules that everyone has been playing with. That the government will take this really active role in funding research with the belief that it's for the greater interest.
And that was a change in that same article, in which you also talk about what you've already said about you've already alluded to the three pillars of development in that area: the universities, the foreign assistance nonprofits, the federal campuses like the NIH. You talk about how the birth of this idea was the result was that these universities would no longer have to go to private funders, constantly be seeking money from private funders, which is iffy at best and not always coming through. But they could depend on a stream of funding from the federal government to dedicated projects, because science research takes time. Did that fundamentally change how we do science in this country, beginning in the late 40s?
Yeah, I mean, you can like the longitude of the studies in terms of just how long it can take, the ambition. I think the boldness, of course, if you think with the private sector, I mean, understandably, they have limitations and they have, relative to the public sector, shorter term demands. And so, yeah, I think it allows for ambition. And a lot of the shots that you take, like in business, same in research, won't pan out. Hopefully, even if it doesn't pan out, it will sort of advance the research to help, future researchers. But yeah, I think it really enabled researchers to think more boldly and longer term.
Brian Gordon's with the Raleigh News and Observer. He writes about this extensively. We also have a couple of scientists with us. Dr. Charles Lee, who is associate professor and a former director for the Center for Biomedical Engineering and Science at UNC Charlotte, and J.P. Flores, a Ph.D. candidate in bioinformatics and computational biology at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Lee, it seems that although the government continues to fund certain research, maybe not to the level or with the dependability of prior administrations, there seems to be a push, and I want to talk about this later on to some extent, toward finding private sources for funding this research. You're in the private sector and you've been in the university sector. Can that work to the degree that we have been successful in the past through government funding?
Right. So as a biotech startup owner, my funding from came from NIH through their SBIR program, Small Business Innovation Research Program, because the market that we're looking at may not be $1 billion market, but it is certainly very important to quite a large number of people. And we're working with the Mayo Clinic and other small startups to work on this. And they have products ready to go. But they said the private sector will not invest until they've seen some clinical studies, which NIH would fund. So these are there's a gap there, and I think that private companies are going to be a little bit hesitant to fund early stage research without more development and more results that NIH would normally take a chance on.
Charles, is that what they call the Valley of Death?
That is the Valley of Death, exactly. And we're experiencing it. And right now, there's actually, I was just informed that the SBIR program at NIH and at NSF did not have a call for grants this last funding deadline in January. So therefore, no SBIR grant proposals were submitted to NIH, and we're not sure if Congress is in the process of renewing it, because it needs to be renewed on an annual or it needs to be renewed. So I don't know enough about that at this point, but I was just told that was the case.
So this certainly has a statewide impact because of the importance of the research triangle to the economic viability of North Carolina, but it also has a worldwide impact and an American on the world stage impact, which I want to talk about when we come back, but we have to take a break. And when we do, we'll come back and talk about that. We'll talk about other things that are happening with regard to how these projects get funded and what it means for those scientists and all of us who benefit.
On the local news roundup, a petition to remove the Mecklenburg County Sheriff. The DA has asked for an investigation into the charges. More bad news for Sycamore Brewing, and the Carolina Panthers back their way into the playoffs. Those stories and more tomorrow at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Don't miss a beat. Tune into the Charlotte Jazz Channel and hear today's brightest young artists alongside the legendary jazz icons. Whether you're an avid jazz enthusiast or just looking for an oasis from the news, the Charlotte Jazz Channel from WFAE is available 24/7 on our mobile app at WFAE.org or on WFAE HD2 on the radio.
Filmmaker Shireen Dibus was about to begin shooting a movie about generational trauma among Palestinians when the war in Gaza began.
You know, some days we were shooting scenes that we were watching come across our news feeds, things that were happening in Gaza.
I'm Juana Summers, the new film All That's Left of You, on All Things Considered from NPR News.
You can catch All Things Considered at 4 p.m. on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded 90.7 WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the impact of cuts to scientific research funding from the federal government under the Trump administration in the last year. It began, obviously, on January 20th of last year, so we're not quite a year into this. Brian Gordon is with us. He's a business and technology reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. Dr. Charles Lee is here, associate professor and former director of the Center for Biomedical Engineering and Science at UNC Charlotte and the COO of a medical research startup called VitriStor. And J.P. Flores is a Ph.D. candidate in bioinformatics and computational biology at UNC Chapel Hill. I mentioned, Dr. Lee, that in 2025, UNC Chapel Hill received about $50 million less from the NIH compared to the same period the previous year, 2024. And that's just a snapshot of the funding cuts there. How have research projects at UNC Charlotte, and once again, you are speaking as a professor and not for the university, but how have research projects there at your campus been affected by these cuts?
I can probably speak from my personal experience in terms of the funding is that things have been delayed. A continuation project, which should have started February 2025, was not awarded or activated until midsummer. And then we were a subcontractor and we didn't get that until October. And that grant year ends end of January. So we basically have to use all that money in like 3 months. And during that period, we've had to request bridge funding from our department and college, which, were very generous in helping us cover costs for technicians and graduate students and so forth. So that's been the biggest impact for us. I think that I have heard of the university, some grants from the university being cut or not approved, but I think that you will have to speak with the university about the specifics because I don't know.
One thing I do know is that as of May of last year, 17 research grants were terminated at UNC Charlotte, totaling about $14.3 million. There may have been others, and some of that may have been restored, but I don't think so. JP, I would imagine that these cuts not only impacted projects that were already underway, but they call into question projects that may be on the drawing board or in the pipeline already, but just not they haven't begun work on them. So talk about how this works, because research can take and does take years of pre-planning and then years of experimentation until the product is or is not fully realized. Talk about how it works and the impact of this.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike. So as a graduate student, particularly at UNC Chapel Hill, the way that this works is you apply to this graduate program at UNC. It's an umbrella. Right. So at this point, I'll use my case as my story as an example. Came from Los Angeles, California. I did biochemistry as a major, wanted to do graduate school to do research. At this point, I wasn't certain in what field I wanted to go in, but UNC has an umbrella program where they have 14 different programs you can silo into. In that first year, they put all the first years together. So it's about me and 99 other people. We have 3 rotations. These 3 rotations can be very flexible. You can go from a computational biology lab to a toxicology lab to a cell biology and physiology lab. And at this point, you're trying to work with an advisor to figure out what you want to do for the next 5 or 6 years of your life, right? And along the way, you are applying for different funding opportunities. This can range from the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which, by the way, last year, went from 2,000 awards to 1,000 awards. So those awards are split in half. So you're applying for these awards with a small chance that you're actually going to get them, while you're also doing experiments that can take years to optimize. I'm a computational biologist, but I also wanted to do wet lab experiments, right? Moving liquid from tube to tube. I was trying to do experiments under a microscope, and it took me a year to figure out how to do that. Right. So I think at the end of the day, science takes time. Right. And when you have all this uncertainty and all the stress about funding kind of put in front of you, it's hard to be a successful graduate student.
Things change, methodology changes, so politics changes things as it is right now. But you're young, so you're not steeped in the tradition of what came before. So I'm wondering, from your point of view, as a young person going for their PhD who has not been in the business for 50 years, what this means to you in terms of having to change where you look for money.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to looking for funding, I am somebody. So I want to mention I'm a late stage PhD student, so I'm actually about to embark on the next stages of my career. And when it comes to funding opportunities, whether it be academic, because that is the path I want to go down, the options are are hard to find, right? I want to become a postdoctoral research scientist. You look at the NIH, right? I do some science policy on the Hill, and a lot of opportunities at the NIH are not there right now, right? A lot of labs funding is shrinking. So if I want to move back to Los Angeles, California, and interview for a specific lab that is doing research that I'm particularly jazzed about, it really depends on if they have the money to support me, right? Initially, I do genetics research now. I wanted to study rare diseases. Rare diseases is one of those things that hasn't been heavily supported in the past, and that is shrinking with all of these different funding cuts, right? There's a lot of discourse about trials being delayed. I have a friend who is a rare disease patient. She's actually a Netflix director, and her trial got stopped, and she can only text the person running her trial and just be like, any updates, right? So I think it's really hard because not only are my opportunities getting cut or taken away in front of me, it's also impacting just society at large. And those are the
Yeah.
people, right, that we want to help.
All of which we're going to talk about as we go through this hour. It isn't just experiments that are being delayed or put on hold or stopped completely because the funding dried up. It's people, Brian. You report that, and we all recall that in some areas, when the Trump administration made these massive cuts in people, sometimes the very next day or the very next week, those people were recalled. They were told to come back to work because they hadn't done the advance work to figure out who should go and who should stay. They just did it willy-nilly. You report that as a result, morale at some of these organizations conducting this scientific research is exceptionally low. Aside from affecting somebody's mood, though, what impact has it had on the work?
Yeah, so I think there's the people who had jobs this time last year who don't, so who lost their jobs, and then there's the impact on people who remained. And so, yeah, morale, speaking to some of the local union leaders who had represented the NIH workers and the EPA workers, so those two federal agencies, they share a campus in Research Triangle Park. And yeah, I think it was sort of, is that like the sword of Damocles? Am I saying that right? Of the voluntary buyouts that were offered through Doge throughout the year, just sort of kind of hovering there for several months. So I think a lot of people were thinking, do I take that buyout, seeing what the state of work is right now, or do I kind of keep going and see if I'll still have a job? So I think there's a lot of sort of game theory that people had to do with their careers about what is the right step for me. And those are for the people who were given a choice. Others, it was found pretty quickly that they wouldn't have a job.
There's a lot of uncertainty. That's been thrown into the equation here. Has effects we don't even understand probably in some cases. But it seems to me that certainty, the certainty of at least we know you may not get the funding, Dr. Lee, for your project, but the funding is there for somebody. That's gone away. We don't know that the funding is there for somebody, or even that you'll get even something close to what you need to accomplish what you're setting out to do. But the certainty of that seems to me, an important element of deciding on whether or not to embark on a research project, and more importantly, whether or not to do it in this country. Would that be accurate?
That is accurate. I have you've seen newspaper articles about some of our best scientists being recruited overseas, whether to Europe or to Asia, and that I think is happening. And And then the worst part is the next group of promising scientists and researchers are looking at this landscape, and I think that that's going to be a little bit challenging for them with the uncertainty that is coming up as to whether they can go into this field.
And JP, part of your what you've done with your career so far is to write these op-ed pieces to explain to lay people what's going on in the world of science and how it impacts them and how this is impacting them. And you've written about talking to high schoolers who are interested in science, but as a result of what is happening with this funding cut business, are hesitant to pursue careers in science. We also know that current policies are discouraging people from other countries from coming here to get their educations. And that's kind of a bad thing because many of those people stay in this country after they graduate. And we seem to be discouraging that. In other words, we are creating a brain drain. How long is that sustainable?
I mean, I don't think this is sustainable at all, right? I think you brought up my op-ed earlier, and this kind of opens the conversation about science communication, right? Because public health depends on trust. Research can be excellent, but if people don't understand how it connects to their lives, if high schoolers don't understand why they're studying physics in the first place, you might get misinformation filling that gap, right? So I wrote this op-ed because I've seen how confusion turns into mistrust, especially around health issues. And I do think that we need to start investing in the next generation of scientists. I think a big issue is scientists, especially at UNC Chapel Hill, Duke, NC States, we try to do a lot of outreach to high schoolers and to our local communities, but we don't do enough of it, right? We're not incentivized to do it. We're incentivized to publish or perish. We're incentivized to publish papers, write your dissertation. Hopefully you have 5 and you can leave and move on to your next step. And I do think that this is a paradigm that needs to shift a little bit. I do think that we should be doing more intentional outreach from Charlotte to Asheville to Wilmington.
Well, speaking of paradigm shifts, what's happening with the Trump administration with regard to scientific research funding is a paradigm shift. It's been argued that they're not just trying to upset the world order, but they are remaking it in their own image and likeness, despite the fact that the current setup has kept us at the top of the world and kept the world at peace. We're just talking about the things that they're doing politically and diplomatically around the world. But this is part of that, because since the end of World War II, as Brian pointed out in his article about the establishment of the research triangle, this country has been a world leader in scientific research and medical and other scientific breakthroughs that have made this country not only a beacon of light for science and scientists, but made us a lot of money over the years. We have benefited, but then so has the rest of the world. So, Dr. Lee, can that track record continue in this environment? And if not, what is at stake here?
Wow, that's a really difficult question to look into a crystal ball. I don't think it's sustainable. I think in the short term, we can handle the cuts, but if this were to continue for the next 3 or 4 years, I think that you're going to see a significant decrease in just the number of breakthroughs that that could potentially be coming out if we had sustained funding. This could lead to a number of detriment in the clinical settings, technologies that won't make it into the bedside. So I think that everything as a result of that ultimately leads to poor healthcare as a result.
Administrations come and go, and with politics, the tides shift. If this goes on until the next election, and the next election puts a Democrat in the White House with a Democratic Congress, and they change course again, reestablishing some of the norms that we have been adhering to heretofore, can you recover? Can science recover?
That's another great question. There is the potential, but what you're losing is 3 to 4 years of just potential solid research, 3 to 4 years of potentially new students moving on into their new careers. So it's basically, it seems a short time, but it's almost a generation. And I'll let JP follow up on that.
Yeah, JP, go ahead.
Yeah, something I quickly wanted to mention is given all these attacks on science here in the US, I also have been looking for international opportunities, right? I just had a Fulbright Scholar Award recommended for funding, not because I want to leave the US, but because uncertainty makes people plan contingencies, right? When I think a lot of other colleagues of mine are thinking of doing the same thing. And in fact, some people have actually left. I think the US for a long time has been this beacon for global science, education, and public health. But these attacks are really allowing European nations to accommodate US researchers in a way that kind of has been replicated before, right? I think Germany had this program called the Meitner-Einstein program where during the rise of Hitler, Nazi Germany, people were leaving the country to come to the US. And that kind of helped set up the strong scientific infrastructure we see today.
That's kind of my next question. If we don't do it, will the vacuum be filled elsewhere in the world? And aside from the fact that maybe you will not, as a patient, have access to certain medical trials because they're not being done here anymore, they're being done in Germany or Japan or someplace else, how else will we suffer? Brian, you want to answer that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious with JP or maybe even Charles. So I know, like with a lot of what we're seeing in the US, I've heard has been reflected in other countries as well, maybe towards like immigration stances moving more conservative, restrictive, and funding getting tighter in other ways. So I'm curious, is what we're seeing here, are you seeing that? Like even if Europe has become, or Asia or other places, an outlet for people who can't find opportunities here, is your sense that those opportunities abroad are getting decreasing as well, or do they feel plentiful?
From my perspective, as a graduate student looking for that next step, it looks rather plentiful, right? Like on Instagram, I'll scroll on my feed and I see Marie Curie Fellowship from France. Are you a US scientist come to France, right? I've had some of the best scientists I know, also graduate students at my same stage, looking only in Australia because, they might have a small connection there, but they don't want to be here, right? So if anything, I see things opening up in other places, but maybe Charles has a different take on that.
I have 20 seconds, Charles. Go ahead.
I don't know if I have anything to follow beyond JP because I think that he is in that process, so he is much more aware of it than I am.
Okay, when we come back and we'll talk about how some of these other countries fund this research, if it's going elsewhere, where do they get the money? How do they do this? And there'll be other things to talk about as well. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
The Trump administration has claimed vast authority to remake the federal government and increase presidential power. What's happened with the hundreds of legal challenges pushing back? That's next time on 1A.
Charlotte's strength lies in the stories that often go unheard. Equilibrium brings you the voices shaping our community, from immigrants building new lives to the diverse experiences that make Charlotte home. Discover the resilience, innovation, and culture that drive our city forward. Equilibrium delivers the deeper stories of race and equity in our community that help us understand Charlotte's true character, straight to your mailbox. Subscribe to Equilibrium at wfae.org/newsletters, because every story matters.
I'm Mary Louise Kelly.
And I'm Steve Inskeep.
One of the things you can count on from NPR and this station, we've got your back when it comes to reporting the news.
And one thing this station counts on is contributions to keep it going.
A really easy way to support this station is donate a vehicle you don't need anymore.
It's free to you and could be worth hundreds of dollars in support. Thanks.
Learn more at wfae.org/cars.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFAE.org. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about federal cuts to science, how that is impacting North Carolina and our university system and other areas of research in this state and around the country. And we're talking about it with three individuals. Brian Gordon reports on this extensively for the Raleigh News and Observer. He's their business and technology reporter. J.P. Flores is a Ph.D. candidate in bioinformatics and computational biology. I don't even know what that is, at UNC Chapel Hill. And Dr. Charles Lee is an associate professor and former director of the Center for Biomedical Engineering and Science at UNC Charlotte and the chief operating officer of a medical research startup called VitriStor. Patrick McRae, who is an historian with the University of California, Santa Barbara, recently told NPR that the three things that American efforts in scientific research have given us since 1945 are better health, a better economy, and national security. Brian, that seems to be true without doing any more research. I mean, those seems to be, on the face of them, true statements, irrefutable statements. Are those things even on the Trump administration's radar? Have those things been discussed when deciding to make these moves?
I mean, I don't have internal knowledge about the administration. I think that the argument, like, undoubtedly, yes, it's irrefutable that research has helped and that it's all about, I mean, whether it's the right bang for the buck, which seems almost incalculable. Like, what is right is so subjective, and there are so many billions of dollars over so many years, so many efforts, that what is the right sort of yield for that money that we're spending? And that's ultimately the question. This is an overhaul of the role that they believe that the government should have and the types of research that they have, even down to how they're funding money with kind of multi-year upfront spending, which really kind of just picks smaller numbers of awards to give more money to, but in a shorter amount of time. And yeah, it's hard to know what the overall mission is. I know a lot has been talked about Project 2025 and this idea. But yeah, it's just belief that the federal government has been too active in these efforts. Of course, it's yielded great results, but they're arguing that there has been waste inefficiencies in this effort.
So I guess the question, Dr. Lee, is the fact that the government has been doing this since World War II. The funding mechanism has been the same pretty much since then, and has led to our preeminence in science here and around the world, and the medical benefits and other scientific breakthroughs that have come as a result of it have put us at the top of the heap. Is that because other countries aren't doing this, because they don't have to do it? And if we don't do it, will they? And are there funding mechanisms there in place that will work as well from a scientist's point of view?
I think that the U.S. Took the lead because we had the largest economy, and therefore had the greatest, a much bigger capability to fund these large projects.
And we still do. We still do.
And actually, you're absolutely right. We still do. I think that in the other countries, I think that the pot is just going to be smaller, and it's great that JP has been able to find opportunities, and they are attracting some of our best and brightest to go there, and I really applaud them for that. But I really don't know the statistics to know how sustainable this push is.
JP, I read yesterday that there are scientists out there in the world, particularly in America, who feel that American science is suffering irreparable damage. Irreparable damage. Is that hyperbole?
I think this can be seen as, I think it depends on who you are, right? I believe that if you are a famous lab who's well known in the field, you might be okay. And I think people can even debate that now, given the new policies on multi-year funding, et cetera. I think it can be irreparable for people, right? If you are an early career scientist and you are looking to become an investigator right now, and if all these policies pass, this is a weird window where funding just isn't there, right? People can argue it will come back in the next 4 or 5 years, but where is that scientist going to be in 4 or 5 years, right? Like, as a 26-year-old scientist, I am looking to start a family. I am looking to live my life. If I was told that I need to wait 4 or 5 years to really get this really big award to advance my career, I'd have to rethink my career, right? Like at that point, it's, can I use my computational skills in another field? Like maybe I'll go into sports analytics given my expertise, right? But at the end of the day, I think for people, it's irreparable. I think science will recover, hopefully at some point, knock on wood. But for people right now, this is detrimental.
The Trump administration, Dr. Lee, says that they are going after woke science, whatever that is, and that the changes to federal agencies, which they've made through these cuts and other mechanisms, are making science better and will benefit more Americans. What's your reaction to that?
Wow. So I know that with all new NIH grants prior to this past year, we had to include, if we're doing animal studies, both male and female animals in our studies because there are differences and we need to determine whether that is the case. And so we think that that's important. We think that that should continue, or at least I think that that should continue, and we hope to do that. And so that's where my understanding of how we're trying to do science better is coming in. None of our research involves any of these other areas that they talk about, so I can't really speak to that at this time.
Brian, just this week, it was reported that Congress has hammered out some final bills covering the National Science Foundation, NASA Science, and the Department of Energy research programs, which restore funding to something very close to pre-Trump levels. If those bills become law, will the restoration of those funds impact any projects in our state?
Yeah, I mean, for science research, any broader funding will impact North Carolina. We're in the top 10 for federal funding in research. I think NIH supersedes a lot of those projects. It is the world's biggest, therefore it's the country's biggest. And so, yeah, some of the patchwork restorations, and that's why kind of coming up with like blanket numbers of projects or dollars is tricky because it is still, the dust is settling, court cases. There's no like one court case that will either decide that all the changes go into effect or not. But I'd say NIH is really the biggest focus. And I thought was interesting with sort of the quote unquote woke agenda. I don't have a long historical view, but I do know, and maybe Charles and JP can speak to this, that in the years leading up to the second Trump term, diversity was not just like permitted but like actively encouraged. I think I would imagine, especially after 2020, there was a mindful intent to highlight diversity impact in your grants. And so that's what I've heard from some researchers is just that like pendulum of being penalized for something, trying to be objective, like right or wrong. It's just that inherent, like, wait, 3 years ago, I wasn't just allowed to, I was encouraged to use these words and highlight this. Now that is why it's being canceled.
So some of these cuts have been restored. Some of these cuts may be restored. And I just referred to that bill being hammered out in Congress that may restore at least a certain sector of cuts back to their original levels or something close to it. And I suppose there are some scientific research projects, Dr. Lee, that can be restarted, even though they've stopped because of a lack of funding. But in your area of expertise, biomedical research, it seems to me that may not always be the case. It may not even be the case in most cases, because can you just stop a research project and then pick it up 8 months later where you left off, or do you have to start all over again?
Yeah, that would be, if I had to stop my projects and start up again in 8 months, that would be like an incredible challenge. In fact, I may even be considering retiring as a result. So I think that these hiatus is not helpful because you lose personnel, people, researchers that you have trained yourself, whether it's graduate students or research associates that you spend, years training to so that they are proficient at what they do. If they have to go look somewhere else, you lose all that knowledge. You lose so that and expertise, and that makes things that much more challenging.
And I don't know if your work involves medical trials using patients who are taking some of the things that are being developed versus placebos, but it seems to me that that's where we've lost focus on some of this, because people, real people, patients whose lives depend on this research and who may have already embarked in these clinical trials, suddenly don't have access to those trials. How detrimental is that to their health and recovery? And how much of that has happened in North Carolina, to your knowledge, Dr. Lee?
That I do not have good information on. Maybe Brian has, because we do work very closely with Atrium Levine Cancer Institute in the past, but due to the pandemic, things have kind of
Right.
siloed. But anyway, I'll leave that up to.
One area that you report on, Brian, that has been compared a little bit to the Manhattan Project, which was the project to develop the nuclear bomb that ended World War II, is the work to find a vaccine to prevent the transmission of HIV. The Trump administration ended funding for that in the middle of last year. And I was going to ask why you would end such research. And then I read that the research is using mRNA technology. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not a fan of vaccines in general, but particularly not a fan of mRNA vaccines. Did that play a role in this decision?
Definitely, possibly. I think the stated goal from the administration didn't mention mRNA. So their line was that we have just many different HIV efforts and we wanted to consolidate them. Duke University and a researcher named Barton Hayes was kind of quarterbacking a consortium, a decades-long consortium to advance this vaccine for HIV. But the mRNA, which really was born out or advanced during the pandemic, that was like how quickly we got a vaccine, was really on the back of mRNA, which just helps progress vaccines faster. That technology, they then piggybacked on the COVID-19 vaccine to bring to this decades-long HIV effort. Secretary Kennedy is, of course, not a fan. There's a lot of what researchers would say is unfounded fears about mRNA. It really, they would say, it goes towards the process of development and is less so about the final product. It just really helps you test and iterate faster.
I guess it is that. Yeah. I guess it is medical research where people really understand the benefits, the pluses and minuses of scientific research, because it impacts them and their family members and their grandmothers and their grandfathers. And it's not so much what happens with NASA and other things that they see a benefit to, but these funding cuts are not exclusive to the medical research field. They're across disciplines. There have been cuts to the FDA and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Science Foundation, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, even the Department of Veterans Affairs. But JP, you're working in an area that seems to me to have great promise for the future, and that is gene regulation. Why would they hurt you and your projects and projects like yours?
Yeah. So the stuff that I research, I basically study how cells respond to stress, and we find that it physically reorients DNA into a configuration that is better for adaptation. As far as like how the administration can potentially harm work like mine, I think that if anything in my field, a lot of the disturbances have been towards the researchers themselves, the people, right? Like for example, diverse scientists I know when people were looking at these different grant funding cuts, science funding cuts, they were also looking at not just the words in the grants, but also potentially the biosketch.
I mean, I guess the question is, when they made these decisions to cut this funding, did they make these decisions to cut funding based on this broad idea that we're going to cut out waste, fraud, and abuse, and we're just going to slash with a scythe as opposed to a scalpel? Or did they actually look at the individual research projects and grade them for their value? I have about 30 seconds. Did they do that?
I can't say for certain, but I can say right now, when you look at things objectively, they definitely took a chainsaw to the system and grants, and not just surgically scalped and picked grants.
So Brian, I have 30 seconds. And when you talk to science and university officials and others working in these three pillars in the research triangle, universities, foreign assistance, nonprofits, and federal campuses, do they see, with these moves to restore some of this funding, do they see a light at the end of the tunnel at all?
I don't think they see the courts as coming to their rescue. I think there's a sense that they need to pivot towards areas that will be funded. They need to find funding elsewhere, or as JP mentioned, some people need to leave the sector and find work elsewhere.
Gives new meaning to Edward R. Murrow's sign-off. Good night and good luck. Brian Gordon, the business and technology reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. Dr. Charles Lee, associate professor, former director of the Center for Biomedical Engineering and Science at UNC Charlotte and COO of medical research at VitriStor. And J.P. Flores, a Ph.D. candidate at UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you all for the hour.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Charlotte Talks is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Our executive producer is Gabe Altieri. The senior producer is Sarah D'Elia. The producer is Chris Jones. For more information on